Really? It's as simple as sticking it in your cabinet and walking away. Kind of. Let's talk about curing right here on the Backyard Gardens podcast.
To have a good harvest, one must plant good seeds and must also use the right kind of fertilizer. The carrots have grown large and firm. How good they will taste.
All right, everybody. Welcome to the Backyard Gardens podcast. We are a listener-supported show, so if you would like to support us and keep us going, you can check us out and link below at Patreon, where you get extra episodes and all kinds of other fun stuff. We're working on a big announcement. And then also you can buy T-shirts and stuff like that at Teespring, or you can use our Amazon list, which will give us a little bit of the profits, and you get nothing. But we have a whole section about canning, and all of these are products that we use and trust in our gardens and our homes. So please help support the Backyard Gardens podcast.
I think you said they get nothing if they go to Amazon. They're not charged anything more. Yeah.
Yeah, you're not charging anything more. You don't get nothing. You get what you pay for.
Yeah, I assume Amazon's gonna send you what you ordered.
Yeah, I would hope so. So today we are carrying on our food preservation, and we are talking about curing, which is one of my favorites personally.
Well, before we dig into curing, I'm going to make an about face, and somehow between us stopping our recording of last week's episode, I got really excited about pickling. I can't just a couple of searches came across a few recipes. So go back and listen to last week's episode if you want to, hear more about that process, because I may be diving in deeper. All right, but let's move on to curing.
Yeah, let's move on. So that was a quick change, by the way.
I know.
All right, so our nice, gentle friends at the National Center for Food Home Preservation say this about curing, and this one's not as long as last week. So the earliest curing was actually dehydration. Early cultures used salt to help desiccate foods. Salting was common and even culinary by choosing raw salts from different sources, i.e. rock salt, sea salt, spice salt, etc. In the 1800s, it was discovered that certain sources of salt gave meat a red color instead of the unusual unappetizing gray. Consumers overwhelmingly preferred to the red-colored meat. In this mixture of salts were nitrates, and as the microbiology of Clostridium botulinum was... Oh, man, these are a bunch of big words. Elucidated in the 1920s, it was realized that nitrates inhibited this organism. So that doesn't really pertain to us as well, which is interesting. But I guess you could use, there's two ways to look at curing. We need to say that right now since it was read that way. There's curing meat, and then there's curing vegetables. Okay, we're not really going to focus on curing meat, but you can look into that if you would like. So curing vegetables, I think the very first line says it when it was actually dehydrating. Within a sense. And what do you say? I'm
fine with that. Like this idea of something staying in a place, until a certain time has passed, and then it's ready to be consumed in the way you intended. So, I get it.
Right.
But I wouldn't consider sweet potatoes or, a squash that I wouldn't consider those that I'm actually drying them. But again, I get it.
Well, hold on. Let's talk about that real quick. So just to be clear, long-term curing for vegetables for long-term storage includes garlic, onions, potatoes, sweet potatoes, and winter squash. And you're not really drying them, but in a sense you are, because there's a process in which you get the water to you lower the water content of the vegetables so that because the water in the vegetable is what causes it to rot. So I like to say, like I told my wife last year, we were curing our sweet potatoes, and she's like, when are we going to be able to eat the sweet potatoes? Like, I'm ready. And I'm like, you got to wait. Because if you put them in there, if you pull them out of the ground, you put them in there, they're still damp and everything. Two things happen. One, they can bruise very easily. And 2, it'll introduce rot because there's still that moisture. And as it gets in, it introduces bacteria and stuff like that. So there is a process to the curing. Now, the long-term storage of putting it into your cabinet and walking away is not curing.
Well, that's just the storage of it, right? So
Right.
I mean, I guess maybe again, here I am changed. When you think about like harvest your onions on a dry day, because a part of what you're trying to do is dry out that moisture. That's a part of curing your onions, right? So you don't want to start, if you can help it, with something that's kind of, really damp. Same idea with, in a most ideal situation, you want to harvest sweet potatoes. I've even sweet potatoes and white potatoes that are more dry, that are already in the ground in your containers or whatever, because it just puts you one step ahead. It doesn't mean that if they're wet, you can't go ahead and cure them. But to your point, yeah, you want to make sure you're careful around kind of how damp that thing is. And if it's actually, if there are any nicks on them, because that's where that moisture is going to settle. Yeah. And, that's where you could have, as you're curing it, you can, as you're watching it, you can see that it's starting to mold, so you have to be careful around that.
Right. I mean, last year I did a video about harvesting my sweet potatoes, and there was a sweet potato where I stuck my hand in the ground too hard to pull it out, and not my fingernail, but my finger rubbed the skin off of it. So that's how easily they're bruised at that point. Now, when you go to the grocery store, you can pick up a sweet potato and you can walk through the whole store and juggling it and drop it, and you don't have that issue because they've been cured. And curing is not an overnight process. It's a fortnight process. It takes time. And it's part of, we have sections in our house that we use to cure, and there's all kinds of places you can cure, but there's specific temperature and humidity ranges that you really want in order to really maximize that.
So there's some things that, and I don't know, I've struggled to get to the recommended ranges for humidity and for temperature. But there's some things that you're curing to allow that vegetable to continue to develop flavor, right? When there are other things that are being cured for the purpose of kind of solidifying it is probably the wrong word to use, but you could go back to saying like, okay, it's dry in the sense of like a squash, and now it can store for much longer. Like it's completed that process of growing, and now we're headed into storage. But I don't know. You tell me, your butternut squash, if you would have eaten it that first day versus letting it cure, would it have been as tasty?
So the curing process actually releases the sugars
for the squash
inside of, it really, for all of them, essentially.
White potatoes, you could eat them straight out of the ground. Like you straight out of the ground. Eat it just like an apple.
If you cure them, it still releases a little bit more of the sugars for that. But typically your winter squashes and 100% your sweet potatoes, if you don't cure your sweet potatoes, it's a totally different flavor. Yeah. And some people enjoy that flavor. But generally speaking, you take those and you cure them, and it releases that sugar content back out into the fruit and concentrates it more because you're taking out that excess moisture content. And
that the plant is receiving as it's in the ground growing, right?
Right. So for me, when I do my garlic and my sweet potatoes and even my white potatoes in particular, which is the first year or so, but I cure them all in the same way. I either cure them in my shed, which is hot and dry, or I cure them in my garage, which again is hot and dry, but my garage has a lower humidity level than outside. So I found... This year I actually discovered something. If you keep your garage door shut, it'll be cooler in there and you'll pay less on your electric bill. So there's that.
Okay.
So I kept my garage door shut, and it's still hotter than in my house, but it helps to slow that process down and then allow it to kind of easily dry. Because if you leave it out in the rain, you're just introducing the water back into it. So you really want to keep it dry. My shed gets really hot, but it also gets humid as well. But it doesn't get the dew on it and stuff like that, which will raise the I'm going to use a term here, locally raise the humidity level around that potato. So you may have very similar humidity levels in your garage or your shed, but they're not exasperated by the dew settling on them, the rains and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think if you're curing something in a new space, keep a close eye on it. So just because you're like, you think you understand the conditions, I had and this isn't necessarily curing, this is more drying. I had some sunflower heads last year, and I cut them off the stalk, and I put them in my garage, and it was kind of like, oh, I'll get to them, and it didn't occur to me how much moisture were still in the sunflower heads.
Yeah.
Right. And so in my mind, my garage is dry, it's warm. And then the next statement is, and it's the perfect opportunity for mold to set, as that, sunflower head is still very wet. And again, not wet to the touch necessarily, but some of these crops, you're in a better situation because they don't have the nooks and crannies as much to basically be able to hide that moisture. But for garlic this year, which is the first year I successfully grew it, I absolutely was like, for the first week, was looking at it every day, checking it every day. And then I got kind of, the confidence kicked in. I'm like, oh, it'll be fine, which it has turned out to be fine. I let it cure before I started using it, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3. But for these other things, I've cured and ultimately stored things like spaghetti squash, and those are probably the easier crops, the ones with the squash with the hard shell. It's going to be an easier time for curing. And in my limited experience, less of an opportunity for things to go bad. Potatoes, especially white potatoes, it's I think you should just eat them all after you've cured them. No. Those are definitely, when you talk about the skin, the softness, that's definitely something that, and I've cured all of this in my basement, that you want to keep an eye on and monitor, especially if you have these things like kind of lined up closely, so being cautious of things like just putting them into a box, right? because potatoes, you've seen it in all of your life. One potato goes bad, man, it's going to grab, it's going to grab the rest of its partners, and they're going to go bad too. Potatoes, Breaking Bad.
And when you have that moisture, so first of all, the sunflower, you were drying it, but I think you were technically curing it as well, because as we've found out and discussed, it's basically drying, but not desiccating.
Well, they're actually
just sucking all the moisture, like making jerky or something like that,
So there are actually 2 methods. So what I was doing was more or less drying to buy me some time, right? Because the head of the sunflower was absolutely brown. The seeds were formed, right? But if you harvest your sunflowers earlier, then you're curing it until it gets to the point where the seed is like kind of fully available for consumption, if you will. So there are 2 time frames you can harvest a sunflower. So I definitely think you're right in that first stage, the earlier, like you're harvesting it earlier. I definitely would consider that curing, now that you mention it and you describe it that way. This is, though, it's a favorite of mine because it's kind of set it and forget it. Like not exactly, well, definitely once you get past the curing stage, but it's, you're keeping an eye on it. It's less babysitting, you're not looking for fungus every day, like when you're fermenting, and you can move on to the next task. Obviously, some of these preservation methods, once you've worked with the vegetable or the herb, you're done. But this is something that, you're talking about little work. Right? You're just monitoring. And then the shelf life for these is pretty substantial. We're not talking years, but a lot of people get from one season to another with some of these crops.
Yeah, my sweet potatoes, I still have a handful left, and it's been about 1 year since I harvested them. And so that's, they say harvest or cure it for 2 weeks. I do mine for about a month just to make sure. And I do set it and forget it, but I'll come out and check on them. Sure. It's part of, our garden walks. You know, at some point I'll go out there and I'll just be like, oh, let me go check on them, and maybe I'll roll my potatoes a little bit or something like that. I make sure that they're getting good airflow all the way around them. So if you're blessed enough to have like a wire rack or something where the air can just really circulate around it, then you don't really have to worry about it at all.
Yeah.
But if you have them in like a cramped space or something like that, I've heard of people using like their spare bathroom and putting a space heater in it because that will keep it warmer. Because you definitely want the heat, but it also suck the humidity out of it too, out of the air. So you can, do that. And some people even go as far as taking a shower in that bathroom every once in a while, just to kind of give it that fluctuation level.
Yeah.
To kind of help slow that process down as well. It's a little bit more complicated if you do that. But once you've cured, and all of the vegetables that we talked about in the beginning is, that's basically how you cure them.
Well, I'm going to disagree. Hold on. I'm going to interject here because some of these things need a cooler temp, like sweet potatoes for sure. You want kind of a higher temperature, higher humidity, but garlic, you don't want it to be 80 degrees. I don't have it in front of me, but it's as far as I read, again, first year, but I was pretty diligent about reading on this. It's definitely a cooler temperature, something like 70, 75 degrees at the highest.
Yeah. And so honestly, it comes into when the garlic's harvested because generally speaking, it's cooler that time of year when it's harvested. So it kind of, if you're doing it in a outside or in a place like that, it works to your advantage. So, there are temperature changes for them, but the general process of getting the airflow and all that, lower humidity, warmth. You don't want to put them in the refrigerator to cure them. No. So,
but the airflow, I want to make sure I put an asterisk by that. That's significant. And one of the ways that, beyond, I don't have like a drying rack that's outside. So a lot of people have like a drying rack that they use for this kind of stuff, a shady spot. In some cases, you want to avoid like direct sun. But I've been able to double back and use my seed starting racks because they're in the basement, so
I do the same thing. And
wired racks, I should say.
Yeah, wired racks. And I left my garlic outside for about 4 or 5 days in the shade before I brought them in and really cured them in my garage. But I want to spend the last few minutes talking about the storage process afterwards because it's really important. And it's easy, but it's important to follow that process because if you've cured them correctly, then the storage process is really straightforward. It's not in the refrigerator, but it's in a cooler place. And a lot of places that you would typically store these foods are naturally going to be cooler. So like in your cupboards or cabinets, whatever, there's usually not a heating vent in that space. So it'll be cooler. It's dark in there. You want it dark. And then using it in like cardboard. So we all order stuff from Amazon, stuff like that, like reuse like a shallow cardboard container so they're not constantly piled up on each other, and that'll help with any kind of moisture that's in there. The cardboard will kind of suck it out slowly. It shouldn't be so wet that it will hold the moisture for a long period of time. And I even store some stuff under my guest bedroom, under the bed. So I'll do that too, where it's real cool in there. Typically we have the vents closed off in the wintertime so we don't heat that space more than we need to. And then that'll help as well. Only problem with that is if you need something like when you got to go and pull it out and all that stuff. But this is all part of why food preservation in my mind is why gardening is not a hobby. It's a lifestyle.
I was just thinking about how we are trying to accommodate for the kind of us re-entering this garden world, this growing food, right? Us being, more sustaining, more self-sustaining. And, the ancestors have already figured this all out. They already had different shelters, different, units on the property that serve these purposes. And it's interesting to see us try to be creative to mimic those things that were basically a standard before, root cellars, things like drying racks, if you ever seen some of the old farms where they have like 5 or 6 different little houses, if you will, and those 5 or 6 different houses aren't really houses for people to live in. They're, it's a smokehouse. This is where you, harvest, if you will, and prepare your chickens and your poultry and so on. So anyway, just a thought that I'm saying out loud that was in my head.
No, you're exactly right. And I think when you get into food preservation, you tap into that a little bit easier. I think a lot of the problems and expense that people walk into are because they don't want to give part of their house or their property to these things that ultimately, if you want to do this, you're going to do it. But when you start trying to find like tricky ways to do it and store it away, it just makes it more difficult.
Yeah.
And instead embrace having the produce and stuff out and embrace having that there and curing it. And when people come to your house, like, what is this? What's going on here? And you explain to them, like, it's crazy, but it really helps out.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think the only thing is just make sure it's not so spread out where you don't remember where what is.
Yeah.
I'm still looking for a pair of orange scissors right now. But anyway.
Yeah. So everybody, that's curing. Please help support us. Check us out. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Miss Batavia's got something she wants to tell you guys.
Again. See ya.
Now you know why people feel like celebrating at harvest time.
All over the world, people have feasting and good times when the crops have been gathered in.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for checking out the Backyard Gardens podcast.
If you like what we're doing and you want to continue to support the podcast, head over to our Patreon page to sign up.
You can also make a one-time donation using PayPal. Both of these links are in the description.
With your support, we can continue growing and helping others in their gardens. See ya.
If you guys want some Backyard Gardens gear,
go to the link below and check out our t-shirts, mugs, pint glasses, and other gear.
All purchases go towards helping to support the show, so thank you so much in advance, and we hope you enjoy. We want everybody to have a garden, and we're going to give you a chance to win free seeds every month.
Head over to backyardgardenstv.com and enter your email address to be entered in all of our giveaways.
Good luck.
We want you to be a part of our gardening community. DM us a picture of your garden at Backyard Gardens TV on Instagram, and we will share it with our listeners.